My Hero Academia is an extremely important series to me, and it's ending soon. At the time of uploading, we're in the final arc. This series is responsible for the entire online platform that I've built, which at the time of writing this script is nearly 2,000 Twitter followers and almost 1,000 YouTube subscribers. My Hero Academia as it stands now is a massive entity, selling millions of copies per volume, getting multiple spin-offs, games, and its own movies. Of course, just like any series, it wasn't always like this. Kohei Horikoshi, the author of MHA, originally wrote a one-shot for Akumaru Jump, a seasonal edition of Weekly Shonen Jump featuring many amateur mangaka. The one-shot was called Tenko. It featured a young, white-haired boy who hated everything, but most of all, hated swords. He would go around feudal Japan decaying weapons by grabbing them with his own hands. Tenko isn't alone in this. Much of My Hero Academia contains designs or ideas from Horikoshi's previous series, like Omagadoki Zoo, his first serialized manga that only ran for 5 volumes. After Horikoshi's second serialization, Barrage, failed after just 2 volumes, he was depressed, out of ideas, and even considered giving up his lifelong dream of being a mangaka. He decided to give it one last go and revisited a one-shot for Akumaru Jump that he had made in 2008, My Hero. Jack Midoriya, the protagonist of the one-shot, is a powerless salaryman in a world of heroes versus aberrants. Instead of acquiring a power, he puts on hero support gear and usually gets his ass beat. Obviously, this idea needed to be workshopped a bit, until it became My Hero Academia. My Hero Academia was entering Weekly Shonen Jump on July 7th, 2014, which gives it quite the interesting circumstance of entering the magazine right before one of the magazine's biggest series and serialization. Just 4 months into MHA's run, Naruto would end. With this heavy hitter ending, people were looking for a spiritual successor to it. During MHA's initial serialization, it was seen as pretty alright. It was often regarded as a typical shonen plot, but with a few interesting twists on certain tropes. Its popularity did slowly grow, however, while it's performed well in Japan and continues to do so, My Hero Academia is an even bigger success in the overseas market. On November 4th, 2014, right before Naruto's ending, the first volume of the series was officially released, ranking 7th on the weekly Oricon manga chart, with 71,575 copies sold, selling out almost immediately on its first printing. In the first month, it sold 137,449 copies, a pretty humongous start for the series. Before we get into the arc-by-arc review and analysis, I would like to present some general themes that the series has introduced, and we can use that as a baseline for our discussion and examine how well the series delivers on said themes. In my opinion, MHA's themes are as follows. What does it mean to be a hero? This is explored through various characters and how they express their heroism, such as varying methods as demonstrated in Act 2 of the series. Societal discrimination. We are introduced to this theme within the first couple of pages of the series, as well as touched on multiple times thereafter. The pressure of expectation. This is shown quite pertinently via our protagonist Midoriya Izuku, his rival Bakugo Katsuki, and some guy named Shoto Todoroki passing the torch. This is a massive theme given the nature of the Korg One for All, but also with characters like Shoto Todoroki and Tomura Shigaraki, reaching out and connection, something I've touched on previously, but hands represent saving and building connections with people. In response to the ending, I gathered a few of my friends, whose names are on screen now, and we will be spending the next few months working on this series, the Great Retrospective. This is part 1 of 3, with part 3 releasing around the time the manga finishes serialization. We will be going through all 3 acts of MHA and talking about nearly every single arc of the series at length, as well as reflecting on public perception of the series and respective arcs as they released. I would like to preface this entire retrospective with the fact that most of this project is going to be subjective, such is the nature of reviews. This script was a collaborative effort, and some things are going to be left out for the sake of brevity. As mentioned previously, in the beginning of its run, the public perception of the series was that it was just another shonen, with some interesting twists. Not very many people saw the massive untapped potential within, but didn't necessarily write it off either. As a newcomer to WSJ, and with Naruto about to end, I had to prepare to fill some pretty big shoes. As opposed to some massive upcoming titles, My Hero Academia didn't play into Japanese mythology. Demon Slayer and Jujutsu Kaisen, 2 series that would also coexist in the same generation as My Hero Academia, would see massive success by involving both demons and mythological elements. MHA, on the other hand, would instead find its inspiration in Western media, comics specifically. Horikoshi is a massive fan of Spider-Man, and that key detail can be seen repeatedly throughout the series. Spider-Man also makes an appearance as a silhouette in Chapter 1. Let's move on though and get into the first arc. Technically, the community considers this 2 arcs, but they're so short that I've decided to lump them into 1. The very beginning of the series brings us to a theme we discussed earlier by giving us a singular line. Not all men are created equal. This is arguably the most important line in the entire series, and underlines an extreme amount of not only MHA's Hero Society, but even some very important characters. These first few chapters are also when we run into our first immediate subversion of typical shonen tropes, but also our first primary criticism of the early series. In a lot of shonen, you will find protagonists that feel pretty binary in their emotional expression. They can feel overjoyed, being oftentimes loud and abrasive, or alternatively, they can be angry and raw. Seldomly do they stray from this archetype. Midoriya, on the other hand, strays from that binary trope quite frequently. He does feel those two emotions listed above, but he experiences and displays a wide array of emotions, especially early on in the series. This led to one of the most widespread criticisms to date, Crybaby Deku. This is probably the most obnoxious of the criticisms, but it is also one of those things where if people don't like an MC that is willing to show such emotion, there isn't anything I can really do to stop them. It's their subjective opinion, no matter how much it's rooted in some form of stupid appeal to masculinity. For myself personally, Midoriya being an emotional and subversive MC is one of the big draws for me. He doesn't have some horrifically tragic backstory like his family getting slaughtered or anything, but that doesn't invalidate his feelings. For the protagonist, MHA opts to go with a much more grounded and relatable narrative. He's a victim of not only bullying, but societal marginalization. With quirklessness taking up only 20% of the population, he's MHA's stand-in for minority figures. From this, you could surmise that this is where his erratic emotional state and self-doubt comes from. Unfortunately, this leads to people power scaling main character trauma. Moving on from his overactive tear ducts, we are introduced to something that eventually becomes a massive element in the series, the relationship between Midoriya and his now rival Bakugo Katsuki. While we see Midoriya get punished by Hero Society for being born the way he is, we see Bakugo benefit from the expectations placed upon him at birth due to being born with a powerful quirk, despite him being kind of a dick. Due to that power, throughout his entire life, he gets his ego continually stroked as all of his behavioral issues are swept under the rug by guardian figures, all due to his potential, leading to hell on earth for Midoriya. We can see this societal hierarchy at work even at such a young age in their friends group, with Bakugo always spearheading most if not everything, and a chain leading all the way down to the back to the quirkless boy following Bakugo's lead. If a kid this awful is being built up and essentially typecasted into being a top hero, imagine the type of heroes that must exist right now that are even worse, but more on that later. Taking all that was said before into consideration, the story also goes out of its way to immediately establish that all might not be right in this superhuman society. We see how almost everyone in Midoriya's life has aspirations to become a hero, because if you're not a hero, then what are you even doing? The influx of the hero occupation eventually bred an over-reliance and overpopulation of heroes, as is also visually shown to us in episode 1, with the giant villain attack. While a massive villain fight takes place in the middle of the street, people seemingly are unbothered or even seem happy about what's taking place because they get to see some action. At the same time, these new heroes were not at all put to the test, as All Might held basically 40 years of peace in Japan. With the civilians over-relying on heroes, and then the heroes over-relying on All Might, we can get a small implicit glimpse into the fractures that lay upon the foundation of this hero society. After we're introduced to society and the rivalry between Midoriya and Bakugo, we get to see Midoriya hear pretty much what he always expected to hear from his idol.
Can you be a hero? Not without a quirk.
These words cut pretty deep, but are they untrue? We later on see the feats capable of some of the villains in this world. How could he possibly become a hero without a power? Until we see this young quirkless boy show us the true meaning of heroism, running in, powerless to save somebody who torments him from a giant villain, with absolutely no backup. Can he be a hero? Still no. But I don't think that's the message that is trying to be delivered here. Not everyone can be a hero as we know it within the series, but everyone within them has heroism. After all, it is Izuku's own bravery that recontextualizes what it means to be a hero in All Might's eyes, and forces him to act to defeat the slime villain once and for all. This recontextualization also helps him make a massive decision. Midoriya Izuku will be the 9th holder of the great power of One for All. Pause. This too came with its own fandom arguments. There was discourse about how Midoriya didn't earn the right to be a hero. He wasn't even trying before being given the most powerful quirk in the world. He should have trained or something. He should have become a Batman-like character, a hero with no powers and using gadgets to get the job done, as him just getting a power invalidates all the themes of the series. Right? If what you wanted was quirkless Deku, that's cool. There's no inherent problem with that. You're asking for an entirely different story than the one being told because Midoriya getting One for All is the story, but that's your prerogative. In terms of not earning the power because he didn't train or whatever, it is explicitly stated that Midoriya basically knew the truth all along.
Deep down you knew this, all along. You've just been avoiding reality. That's why you were trying so desperately to prove yourself wrong.
He couldn't be a hero without a power. This was just a desperate last attempt to get some form of validation that he never had in his life. His mother never told him the words he needed to hear, and he was put down repeatedly for ever dreaming of being a quirkless hero. Furthermore, he may not have done any strength training, but he frequently strategized and wrote tens of notebooks detailing heroes' quirks and their battle styles. The notebooks were Midoriya's way of training, as he was more suited to an analytical style, which we see plenty of later in the series. As for him getting a power not fitting the themes, well, No. I don't really understand where that reading came from. Midoriya shows us in the first chapter that he didn't need a quirk to express his heroism, and let's loop back to all men are not created equal. This counts for Midoriya in both aspects. He was unlucky to not have gotten a quirk to begin with, but through his dedication, he was given the chance to become a hero through luck. Midoriya earned one for all through his heroic actions, and also through many months of hell doing a fitness regimen with All Might. The final thing I'd like to talk about for the first arc is that Midoriya finally makes his first real friends. Throughout his life, he was treated poorly for his aspiration, but now he is among new peers all with the same goal, and we find his first real friend this arc, Ochako Uraraka. She expresses one of the first moments of kindness that we get to see in reference to our protagonist, when she catches him outside of the exam area. This small moment actually ends up instrumental for Midoriya as a whole, as he finally establishes somebody who will be kind to him. Not only that, but she also completely recontextualizes the name Deku used by Bakugo as an insult, turning it into meaning the Deku who always gives his best, which of course would later be used as his hero name. This chance encounter with Ochako serves as an anchor which will later be used to have a massive turning point in Midoriya's life. I would also feel bad if I left out Tenya Ida, Midoriya's second real friend. These three form the first trio we see of the series, as Ida ends up quite impressed by Midoriya's heroic actions during the entrance exam, feeling great respect and admiration for him, but also viewing him as sort of a rival. To summarize this arc, it's extremely important, obviously, as it's the first arc of the series, but it is definitely slept on in some ways by most people's first viewing. Seriously, this arc is a fantastic reread or rewatch, and Chapter 1 offers an unbelievable amount of substance with future context in mind. It's a great arc. So, on to the next. This is a relatively short arc with not many points for me to say. As a personal tangent, however, this is the arc that made me actually a little bit interested in the series as a whole, even though the promotional art makes Deku look deranged. Class 1A are segmented into groups of 2 to compete against each other, one team as heroes and the other as villains. This is where we get to see all the hero costumes of Class 1A, including oh god, Midoriya, what are you doing? As well as Midoriya and Bakugo's first real fight since they were little kids. Before I get to the main focus of this arc, let's talk about 1A. Throughout the first arc, we're given the impression that Bakugo is somebody, quote, good enough for UA, which paints an interesting picture as to what kind of characters are present there. However, our expectations might be subverted a bit when we get there and see exactly how 1A treats Deku. Instead of a bunch of snobby pricks who suffer from an immensely inflated ego at the age of 15, we get normal kids. This difference shows that not all the kids privileged enough to be enrolled in UA are bad people, establishing a trend for the series of using an archetype or cliche only to be broken. It's also worth noting that the first time Midoriya ever receives kindness in his life is immediately after obtaining a quirk. Not to imply that people like Ochako or the rest of Class A would think ill of him for being quirkless, but it is broadly representative of how quirks are perceived as necessary within the narrative, furthering the previously established theme of nobody being born equal. This arc primarily exists for the development and progression of Midoriya and Bakugo's relationship. We see how Midoriya can in fact hold his own in a controlled environment that enforces an even playing field thanks to his analytical thought processes and years of observation. Bakugo feels that Midoriya has actually been hiding his quirk from him throughout their childhood, and his sudden explosion of power he witnessed made him feel threatened. It wasn't just the power though. A lot of it can be traced back to parts of their childhood, such as the infamous river scene. This weak, useless nobody would dare to offer their hand to somebody as powerful and talented as Bakugo? This wasn't an act of kindness to Bakugo, but instead, he perceived it as Midoriya acknowledging how weak he was. He lashes out at him throughout their life in a desperate attempt to enforce this social hierarchy that hero society supports, to keep this quirkless loser beneath him where he belongs. However, Izuku doesn't see it that way. All of this effort, all of this showmanship, in a way, is an outlet for him to show Bakugo how amazing he thinks he is, and how much he respects him despite the bullying. This is also somewhat self-therapy, as this is the first time Izuku acknowledges his past as something he can use to push himself. This can be seen in how he transforms his former nickname used for mockery into positive reinforcement. This battle was in some ways a battle between two rivals, sure, but more than that, it was a battle for the social hierarchy. Bakugo's last stand to keep Midoriya beneath him, which makes it all the more crushing for him when he faces defeat. Bakugo Katsuki is quite literally a ticking time bomb, even at this point in the story. What this event did, however, was set time to 200% speed. To surmise, the battle trial arc is the beginning of the rivalry between Midoriya and Bakugo, becoming a proper rivalry. And it is the start of Bakugo's descent as he sinks further and further into his inferiority complex. The USJ arc is My Hero Academia's first climax. It is also the arc during which Volume 1 went up for sale for the first time, and as mentioned previously, sold 71,575 copies in its first week, which is a very impressive amount. So it's safe to say the series was well received by the general public. In terms of online communities, I don't think that the perception of the series had changed much beyond it's cool I guess, and this is still your typical shonen, nothing too special. Before I get into the big character of this arc, let's talk about the rest. The USJ served as a huge opportunity to show off Deku's analytical skills and his leadership capabilities during the encounter on the boat boat with Tsuyu and Mineta, as well as providing some cool characterization for most of Class 1A. Despite juggling a fairly large cast, it feels like very few characters get left behind. We also get to see All Might have an all-out fight for the first time in the series as he pummels the absolute shit out of a Nomu, sending it into the stratosphere. This was not super exciting in the manga and was massively elevated by the anime adaptation. We also get to see a great scene to further show Deku's heroism when he uses One for All to jump in to buy All Might just a few seconds the heroes needed for him to survive. This could also be seen as the very beginning of Deku's self-sacrificial tendencies, when he breaks both of his legs saving All Might. This is one of the first times we see the lengths he is willing to go to save somebody. This is also the beginning of a trend one might notice with My Hero Academia. Its fight choreography is lacking. Each combat interaction we've seen so far has essentially boiled down to punching really hard, and this is one of those criticisms that is near impossible to refute, especially this early in the series. However, personally, I don't really mind most of the time, as I feel that more often than not, Horikoshi is prioritizing telling a story than telling a cool fight. Fights in MHA are more about delivering strong emotional messaging and concluding or expanding character plotlines, rather than delivering a flashy show. Of course, this doesn't free it from the criticisms of its choreography, and if you still aren't a huge fan of it, I get it. All Might vs. Nomu may have just been 100 blazing fast punches, but it also told a story of All Might's goal to never give up, to put it all on the line to save somebody else, and his never-ending heroism. Also, it was raw. The biggest part of this arc is the introduction to our big bad, Tomura Shigaraki. This guy is walking symbolism that unfortunately we can't get really that deep into because this is only Act 1. The impression Shigaraki gives us in the USJ arc is that of an incompetent man-child, who throws a fit whenever things don't go his way. He lacks any sort of coherent ideology, which is very apparent after All Might reads him like a book, after he spouts out some platitudes about the monopolization of violence. Shigaraki as a character was found to be very lackluster by the general public, and people just assumed he was going to end up as some fodder villain until he actually made it out of the USJ alive. This is when comments such as MHA has a boring antagonist started, as people weren't really interested in Shigaraki's apparent lack of a goal, lack of ideology, and his childlike attitude. Little did they know, these were very intentional choices for Shigaraki's characterization. He was supposed to mirror our protagonist's growth, something that as far as I understand isn't too common for a weekly Shonen Jump manga. While Midoriya starts out as somebody with a fairly two-dimensional idea of what he wants to accomplish, and a long way to go when it comes to maturing, as does Shigaraki. As much as it pains me, I will bite my tongue and wait for the right time to talk about Shigaraki's growth. The Sports Festival is a very important arc for My Hero Academia as a series. It is one that does so much foundational work that it completely changes the public perception of it. Speaking personally, this is also the arc that actually began to get me deeply invested in MHA. Not only does it introduce some amazing characters, themes, and development, but the anime adaptation of this arc catapulted MHA into the mainstream, and it is what truly cemented itself as the face of a new generation of shonen manga. The adaptation of this arc for the anime also more or less solidified MHA's position as a dominator for award shows like the Crunchyroll Awards, sweeping nearly every season except for this one. The highlight of this arc, Deku vs. Todoroki, is one of, if not the most iconic moment of the entire anime for many, with the climax raking in over 26 million views on YouTube, and is what made many fall in love with the story the show is trying to tell. This arc in the manga had some of the highest volume sales the series had seen prior to its anime adaptation, which was also announced during the printing of the Sports Festival volumes. Getting right into what most people loved about the arc, the Todoroki family drama is something that exposed quite a bit about My Hero Academia's themes as well as becoming a beloved plotline. Seeing Shoto Todoroki's past and the abuse of his father, the #2 hero of Japan, was a massive hook for a lot of people. Sports Festival in its entirety serves as a way for the series to slowly reveal its hand, showing us just how screwed up this superhuman society is. We see a kid who was created through eugenics to surpass All Might, isolated from the rest of his family and beaten to a pulp by his father. The series up to this point had juggled slightly dark topics, but this was the first big holy shit moment of My Hero Academia. As before this, it mostly still kept an upbeat or optimistic attitude on the surface. My Hero Academia's world is portrayed as a rather smooth and well-functioning society where heroes and villains just happen to exist, or at least so it appears. The series had always shown us darker or at least more gray sides of hero society, but they were fairly implicitly gathered by an attentive viewer. This arc is a major game changer in that it begins to peel back the layers of the series' themes and make them more explicit, which in this case isn't at all a negative. Sports Festival breaks down the false image of society that was shown over top with the exploration of prejudice around different types of quirks through Shinso, a boy who, due to the quirk he was born with, was always met with the idea that he could be up to something villainous. Or, for example, we see the idea of questioning the validity of one's reason to be a hero with characters like Ida and Ochako. Ochako in particular faces criticism due to her, quote, seemingly selfish desire to be a hero. Her desire to help her parents' financial troubles with hero work. Her existence and initial hero motivation is also subtly brought back in the following arc, but I guess we could talk about that later. We also see how hero work is very much about publicity even before you become a pro. Jumping back to the U.A Beginnings arc, it's demonstrated to us people have pushed aside the heroics of this occupation to instead focus on the celebrity culture and essentially marketing themselves. Deku is also a victim of this during this arc, when he is forced to show the world that I am here in order to try and secure a hero internship, as the sports festival is used to not just pit 15-year-olds against each other in an arena for society to watch, but also for hero agencies to scout talent. This idea is further extrapolated on during the Todoroki family drama, with Endeavor pushing Shoto to become like All Might. The obsession with celebrity culture is detrimental to every single person who partakes in the society. Looping back to Midoriya's I am here moment, this is also the start of a long trend for Midoriya, the burden of expectation. Midoriya is just a 15-year-old boy who has had a quirk for I think maybe a couple of months at best by this point, yet the rapidly declining symbol of peace and pillar of justice desperately needs to usher in a successor before his pillar collapses. Midoriya feels the expectation of defining himself as the next symbol of peace, just like All Might did all those years ago at the sports festival. This arc also introduces us to a very important concept that will have massive implications going forward. The vestiges of One for All are active. This is when we learn that One for All isn't something as simplistic as passing on power, and is a catalyst for one of the most controversial plot points of the story in Act 2. Deku vs Todoroki is one of the best fights I've ever seen. All of the elements that it introduces, as mentioned above, the animation and the adaptation and the overall execution of it is flawless. In this fight, we get to see Midoriya's first official hero moment, when he desperately tries to save Todoroki from the fate he is heading towards. Full of resentment, Shoto rejects his left side as it represents everything he hates about his father. Midoriya, however, rejects that notion completely. Shoto Todoroki is not Endeavor, and his quirk belongs to him only. Midoriya sacrifices not only the entire tournament, but also his I am here moment in an attempt to save Shoto Todoroki from himself. This battle gives him his signature hand scars, which lives back to the previous idea I've spoken about in the past. Hands, reaching out, and connection are all major themes of the series, and this is that on full display. The scars etched into Deku's hand are not just a permanent reminder of the loss he faced on that day, but also proof of his heroism, of him saving Todoroki and forming that connection with him. More on Izuku, this is where we get to witness the dynamic emotional range that I was talking about in the first arc. He's angry, he's snarky, he's empathetic, and he's happy. He wants to save Shoto while also winning the match. This dichotomy will be touched upon in the next act, but it's an important foundation. Izuku wants to give back to All Might. He wants to give back to a society he feels he owes so much, and to do that, he has to win this tournament. But he can't stand by as a boy is in pain right in front of him. This is why I called it one of the best fights I've ever seen. It's purely character-driven on both fronts. Sports Festival in general has the tall order of handling an absolutely massive cast. We have all of Class 1A, as well as the introductions of Class 1B, and other side characters like Shinso, yet it never feels like it drags on too long or puts spotlight where spotlight isn't deserved. Not only do we get tons of great moments for a lot of the cast, but it doesn't feel like our main character is neglected in any way. Not including Midoriya or Todoroki, there are two standout examples I would like to touch on. Ochako's match against Bakugo is an important fight for the trajectory of her character, and is another example of Horikoshi breaking standard shonen tropes. While you might expect Ochako to base her idea of heroism and such off of her obvious love interest Deku, this arc serves as her breaking that mold. From this moment forward, Ochako's arc will be one about proactivity. This whole time, she has been relying on Deku to get further as a hero, but now she's learning to go off on her own instincts, even if she loses, as demonstrated by her rejecting Deku's plan to beat Bakugo. On the flip side, Bakugo vs Todoroki is also a big moment for the series. In yet another subversion of our expectations in typical shonen tropes, Todoroki's lifelong trauma isn't fixed by the protagonist's encouraging words mid-battle, which very interestingly was actually the original plan as stated in an interview by Horikoshi. Instead, he second guesses himself, throwing the match and giving Bakugo the win, making him the overall champion of the sports festival. This does not go over well with Bakugo, a character whose entire thought process revolves around strength. When Todoroki refuses to use his left side in the battle, Bakugo saw that as Todoroki not acknowledging Bakugo's strength, especially since he used it against his childhood victim Midoriya, and this led to only further ego damage to the boy who thought he had it all until he enrolled in UA. This section was really long, and hopefully that paints the picture of how influential this arc was, not only for the perception and sales of the series, but for the narrative itself. The sports festival was a massive deal in every regard, so let's jump right into another fantastic arc. The Hero Killer arc gives us our introduction to what a lot of people perceive to be MHA's first great villain, and with Shigaraki in the state that he is in now, I can understand why they thought that. All Shigaraki had was a couple of crumbs so far, showing him to be a pretty entitled baby, but we also get a peek into the start of the Midoriya and Shigaraki parallels, and this arc marks Shigaraki's start line in terms of development into our main antagonist. Enough about Shigaraki though. Stain is the villain that actually makes some good points about hero society, bringing up how it is inherently immoral to aspire to be a hero while accepting payment. To Stain, heroism is the innate lack of selfish thoughts and putting your life on the line to save people. No celebrity culture caveats, no monetary gain, just a hero for the sake of being a hero. He deems you unworthy of the title of hero and finds you to be a miserable person for accepting payment or becoming a celebrity, which is an interesting introduction after Ochako's motivation being revealed in the previous arc and Ida's search for vengeance. Not to say it makes them bad people or even heroes, I think it's quite the opposite. Their motivations were introduced for them then to be characterized to give us a sense of, oh yeah, Stain's crazy. Stain was widely influential, not just in the narrative, but in a meta meta sense as well. He's highly regarded, and some people will still even call him My Hero Academia's best villain, despite his physical presence in the story being very short-lived. His amount of screen time is insignificant compared to the absolute impact he has on the story as a whole. He comes, he goes, and he shakes up the world of MHA. He pushes Shigaraki to mature and become more competent, and shows us multiple extra cracks in society that lead to massive ripple effects, such as the questioning of true heroism, which is still a hot ticket debate in the community to this day, heroes like Mount Lady reconsidering their motivations for heroism, Shigaraki's prior mentioned development, and the formation of the League of Villains. This arc also gives us our biggest development in Deku's use of One For All so far, with him finally learning to evenly spread the power throughout his body at all times, using a nice pastry analogy.
The frozen pastry in my hand is me!
No, it's not. Are you okay?
We see him go from an inconsistent, self-destructive mess to somebody who is actually fairly competent thanks to Gran Torino's training, being able to use 5% of One For All. The parallel that I mentioned at the beginning serves as a clear-cut way of demonstrating to us the purposes of this arc. We're introducing characters who heavily influence our protagonists and antagonists so that they can grow and mature into a proper hero or villain. There is a lot more to say about Shigaraki especially, but again, I'll wait. Additionally, we see Deku finally pick his iconic hero name. Deku, in a narrative sense, spawned from Bakugo reading the Izu in his name as De, making it a shorthand in his childish brain for Deku, which is yet another shorthanded version of another phrase, Deku no Bo, as an insult meaning good for nothing or blockhead. Later on, Ochako recontextualizes this once upon a time insult into being short for Dekura Dake, or as much as possible, like giving it your all. The interesting part, however, is when you analyze it in a meta sense, Deku actually comes from an extremely famous poem, Fall Not into the Rain by Kenji Miyazawa. I will read a select few parts of this poem. Be not defeated by the rain, nor let the wind prove your better. Be strong in body, unfettered by desire, not enticed to anger. Cultivate a quiet joy. Count yourself last in everything. Put others before you. In times of drought, shed tears of sympathy. In summers of cold, walk in concern and empathy. Stand aloof of the unknowing masses. Better dismissed as useless than flattered as a great man. This is my goal, the person I strive to become. Finally, we also get to see Shoto Todoroki come to terms with using his left side. The Stain fight serves as a climax for 3 plot points: Ida's thematic questioning of what makes a hero, Midoriya's lack of power control, and Shoto's strong desire to reject his father. Ida comes to accept a part of Stain as right. He abandoned heroics to go on a quest for vengeance, and leaves his hand damaged as a reminder of the thematic loss he suffered that day. Let's also not forget the previously mentioned concept of hands and scars serving as permanent reminders of loss and connection. Shoto comes to accept that his quirk is his own, and he can reject his father while still using his full power to save people, and goes to see his mother in the hospital for the first time since the incident. A great climax to his arc so far, and to a lot of people, the end. We've had 2 of the greatest arcs of the series back to back so far, so let's go for a third. Oh. Okay, the previous part might have been a bit hyperbolic. I for one like this arc more than most people I know, but it is definitely one of the weakest arcs so far, and one of the weakest of the series. Horikoshi, seemingly greatly throughout the series, struggles with frequent multiple ongoing battles, as he bounces POVs like they're going out of business, and this was his first real go at it. I think there was a total of 10 matches going on in this arc, at least according to the wiki, and in the manga, this was an absolute mess. The anime fixed this glaring issue with the arc, so most fans nowadays don't remember just how messy the manga version of this arc was. The arc was a little messy in execution, but it is definitely a bit of a come down after the gas of the sports festival and the hero killer arc. I definitely don't think this arc was bad by any traditional means. We got little bits of characterization for most of Class 1A, and after 60 some odd chapters, finally learned the quirk of this guy. The match with Todoroki and Momo in particular contains nice bits of progression for both of them. However, this arc has 2 standout events. We get to see a massive extrapolation on Midoriya and Bakugo's dynamic, having it reach pretty much its lowest point in their teenage life. Bakugo is fairly unanimously at his most obnoxious in this arc, yelling and screaming at Midoriya during a training exercise, and even going as far as to strike him mid-test. Final Exams demonstrates exactly the course for the future of this character, learning that his toxic mentality and beating the opponent at all costs, with no regards for those around him, was an extremely detrimental mindset, as the 2 lacked teamwork in their test and most certainly weren't going to be able to beat All Might like that. Bakugo's character arc is all about learning that he's not the center of the universe, and that sometimes he has to humble himself to be a team player, or at least be on par with everyone else to achieve his goals. He learns that being a great hero might also mean cooperating as opposed to taking on the burden by himself and focusing solely on beating the shit out of the enemy. This opens up quite an interesting dynamic for Midoriya and Bakugo, as Midoriya has the opposite problem. He prioritizes saving to the point where winning or coming out of a battle safely is of little concern for him, as demonstrated by the following arc. The Final Exams marks the beginning of a new Bakugo, and while he might be the worst in this arc, it makes his coming growth all the more satisfying. The second standout moment is the chapter or episode called Encounter. This moment is genuinely masterclass, and saves the Final Exams arc from being considered mid. We're introduced introduced to Himiko Toga, a character who on the surface seems to be nothing more than yandere bait, and Dabi, who actually gives us some nice foreshadowing for Act 3 by appearing in front of a hair salon. We also finally get the coveted Shigaraki development that I've been so desperately wanting to talk about. As he's throwing a fit about everyone being obsessed with Stain and his ideology, he seeks answers, and finds Midoriya at a shopping mall with his friends. He questions what makes Stain so much more charismatic than him. What drives people to Stain over Shigaraki? Deku further compounds on the ideas that Stain mentioned to Shigaraki. The idea that in order to bring change to society, one needs a clear ideology or doctrine, even if it's just one to portray on the surface.
He's a maniac, but he doesn't destroy things just because it sounds fun. And when things were looking bad for him, he didn't abandon his mission like you did. Even if the way he acted was wrong, he held true to his beliefs. That's the difference.
This conversation helps Shigaraki properly understand that leaving his mark on society requires a clear set of beliefs or something to direct his anger towards. This leads him to utilize the media narrative that Stain works for the LOV. He props his group up as the group that backs Stain, growing their influence and pushing Stain's agenda. Their encounter in the mall also reinforces a big issue in MHA society, which is people's over-reliance on heroes, as mentioned previously in this video. People have become so conditioned to heroes taking care of any sort of issue that they don't even pay attention to those around them, since they figure heroes will take care of whatever problem shows up. This is the beginning between a most interesting relationship between Shigaraki and Midoriya, and now we get back to the gas. The Forest Training Camp is our penultimate arc for Act 1, and it is also simultaneously the first arc that was printing during the premiere of Season 1 of the anime. The perception of the anime was overall positive, as evidenced by the massive spike of sales for Volume 9. There isn't much that stands out about the adaptation of Season 1, but it's definitely serviceable and has a great climax with All Might vs. USJ Nomu. Initially, the anime was supposed to be a constantly running series like One Piece or Naruto, so basically a shitload of filler. Instead, they decided to make it seasonal. That means it still has the continuous production cycle of your typical long-running shonen, but doesn't have all the filler episodes. This is something that'll be very important for Act 2, let's put it that way. In terms of thematic emphasis and stuff like that, this arc doesn't have much of that. It's mostly just rawness and swag, which is very commendable for a battle shonen, so I wasn't at all upset about it. We get introduced to characters like Twice and Muscular, and finally get to see Dabi and Toga in action. We get Ochako and Toga's first interaction together, which would prove to be very important later on, and we see Toga's warped sense of love for the first time. The idea that loving somebody entails becoming just like them. Shigaraki also displays all of the lessons that he's learned up until this point, unveiling his strategy for the Forest Training Camp attack. It isn't necessarily to win, but to instill a fear in heroes and put hero society inside media scrutiny. He also now rejects the idea that the League of Villains are simply pawns, stating,
They're sacrificial pawns?
Come on. Do you really think I'm that heartless? I'd never underestimate their strength. They may have different goals than me, but they're comrades nonetheless.
Deku vs. Muscular is still probably one of the rawest things I've ever seen in my entire life, and while it's not intensely choreographed, it loops back to the previous points I was making about emotion over action. Each punch from Midoriya in this fight is filled with so much feeling that it permeates through the screen. We also learn about how Shigaraki and them plan on capturing Bakugo, presumably to turn him into the next Sasuke Uchiha. So after defeating Muscular, they try to save Bakugo, who still unfortunately gets captured after Midoriya's broken and now burned body can do nothing but lay there and wallow in defeat. A lot of people like to say that Midoriya always wins, which is interesting, to say the least. He has faced tremendous L's already throughout Act 1, and this was his biggest so far. The ever-expanding scars of his body only reinforce this, as his hand is now even more disfigured and he has a massive burn on his arm. The scars on his hand represent his saving of Kota and connection with an estranged boy, while the scar on his arm represents the loss and failure of saving Bakugo. Before Bakugo's capture, we get this very interesting dialogue between Dabi and Shoto.
Well, isn't that a tragedy? Poor little Shoto Todoroki.
This event single-handedly created the largest theory the My Hero Academia fandom had ever seen. The idea that Dabi is the lost Todoroki shown briefly in the sports festival flashbacks. Season 2 of the anime also helped reinforce this idea when his color scheme showed to a wider audience his blue eyes. This theory got so popular that it was more or less accepted as canon and people operated based on it being true. Kamino is our first major climax of the series, and serves as the end of Act 1. I try not to jump ahead a lot, but I feel like I would be doing a disservice to the retrospective if I didn't mention the first core of Season 3. The first half of the third season was some of the best animated content of the entire series, and is more or less the reason why the narrative spawned that My Hero Academia peaked with the Kamino arc. The arc introduces an aspect of the series that is quite interesting, but apparently some people find annoying. Class 1A disagreement. But as we'll see way later, it's something to appreciate in the moment. We see the class debate the possibility of going to save Bakugo themselves from the clutches of the League of Villains, giving us a very interesting layer to their dynamic, effectively severing them from the potential of being a hive mind. It also ties directly back into Ida's moment during the Stain arc, who feels the most strongly about the situation due to his own vigilante mission in the past blowing up in his face. The same chapter also introduces us to something foreign in some shonen manga: consequences for our protagonist. His arms are badly damaged by his encounter with Muscular, being described as a bomb exploding inside of him, with significant damage to his bones and muscles and even more severe damage to his ligaments. He is given some extreme news.
If you sustain this type of injury, even just 2 or 3 more times, I don't think you're going to be able to move your arms anymore.
Which serves as our first major shakeup for the second act. Immediately after, we also get yet another subversion of shonen tropes and expectations. Bakugo Katsuki officially beats the Sasuke Uchiha allegations, which, believe me, were ever so rampant at the time, seeing as how this is also a spiritual successor to Naruto in the magazine. Not only does he beat some allegations, but it's our first sigh of relief for Bakugo as a character since his meteoric fall in the final exams arc. All throughout the series we see him act like a spoiled, mean, and egotistical kid, setting our expectations up for his swap here in this arc, and those expectations don't just exist for the reader, but for Shigaraki as well. But not only does he reject their offer, he does so violently. Bakugo isn't the only one who shows growth in that scene, however. This entire plan of Shigaraki's to capture Bakugo shows his newfound competence as an ideological leader, taking in people with potential to present the system for the ways they have turned out and using them against the state that has created them. In addition, when Bakugo lashes out at Shigaraki and hits him with an explosion, Shigaraki doesn't retaliate. It even stops his comrades from damaging Bakugo. The heroes raid the LOV's hideout looking for Bakugo, and to contrast his previously mentioned growth, we see a brief moment of regression in Shigaraki's character. When his back is against the wall and his plan falls apart, he reverts back to that screaming, petulant man-child. Regression isn't an inherently negative thing in character writing, however, and can oftentimes be used to either contrast their current growth as well as used to catapult a character to new heights. All For One's character introduction in not just the anime but even the manga is one of the coolest character introductions of all time. He walks out, one-shots every hero at the compound, and just floats in the sky like a hanged man, wearing his crazy Darth Vader mask, leaving our group of 5 kids sitting there, imagining only death in his presence. He also permanently injures the number 4 hero, Best Jeanist, who Bakugo had his internship with. He decides not to take his quirk because it would be too complicated for Tomura to use. Seems like a small detail, but this is something important that we'll get back to later. Before we get to the climax of this arc, I have 2 more things that I want to talk about. The rescue operation the kids perform for Bakugo is an extremely cool moment, and we get to see the closest of Bakugo and Kirishima, as he is the only one who could get through to Bakugo due to their previously established friendship. It's also worth noting that the adaptation of the scene in the anime spawned a lot of pretty fair takes about why Bakugo didn't just fly that high to begin with. However, for the anime, an animator once said that they made him fly that high simply because it was badass. He doesn't go nearly as high in the manga. As All Might no longer has to worry about collateral, All For One also makes the same decision, using Kurogiri to warp the rest of the LOV out of the fight. Shigaraki gets sucked into the portal, screaming for his master and telling him that he's not ready. At this moment, All For One essentially accepts his passing of the torch, which is the theme we will be discussing shortly. All Might's weakened form gets revealed to the masses, as they cheer him on without him being able to hear a thing, and his heroic spirit presses forward until he hears something that shakes him to his core.
Tomura Shigaraki, my apprentice? He's Nana Shimura's grandson.
All For One tells All Might the story of how he took in Shigaraki to groom him into hating the symbol of peace, which also shows us a little about All Might's ideology as a teenager. What he felt was that this world lacked a symbol, pillar for society to rely on in times of duress. This pillar ideology on the surface seemed to have worked. Crime dropped, organized crime essentially went extinct, and he held 40 years of peace in Japan. We talked about this previously during Arc 1, however, this pillar ideology wasn't without its consequences. All Might's tenure as the symbol led to an overarching issue of complacency within hero society. The occupation of hero grew to be almost an assumption of somebody's future plans due to the prevalence of them. It became an easy job due to his existence. If he can solve things in a matter of seconds, what was there to be afraid of? Heroes and civilians alike grew complacent and suffered from a bystander effect. The core flaw of All Might's ideology shows its ugly head in his confrontation with All For One. What would have happened if that pillar collapsed? All Might was told at a young age that the heroes who are the strongest keep smiling no matter what. Just like All Might's, Nana Shimura's intentions weren't for that to be negatively internalized, but he forced everything behind a smile, as the pillar known as All Might toppled, and Toshinori Yagi lived on, which was another unexpected thing MHA managed to pull off. This was a fight you have to watch or read completely blind. Seriously. The strong worry you feel for All Might in this is unlike anything else. Kamino seemingly spelled the end of All Might, yet he survives his fight, and gets to watch everything he built for 40 years crumble to dust. There will be much more of this to discuss in Act 2. What we come to see, however, is the end of All Might's Pillar of Justice ideology, and simultaneously the end of All for One's reign of terror. What is ushered in is a new era, the idea of legacy, and the passing of two torches. All Might's fall signals an end to simple, self-sacrificial heroism. He instills his legacy and faith in the still young and inexperienced Midoriya Izuku. He can only access 5% of his master's power, and passes the torch as the next symbol of peace to him. But does this world need another symbol? All for One's fall signals the end of evil for the sake of evil, or comic book villainy. He instills his legacy and faith in the still young and inexperienced Shigaraki Tomura, who is still deeply limited mentally, and passes the torch to him as this world's next symbol of fear. But is he ready to operate in a world without his master? Kamino delivers on what I believe to be a core theme of My Hero Academia, and this is why this event occurs at the end of Act 1. MHA is a story about the next generation, and Act 2 serves as a shedding of simple comic book heroism and evil, as the themes of the story only grow more complex when All Might and All for One simultaneously fall. In terms of meta, the finale of Act 1 is when hype for My Hero Academia was more or less at its all-time high in online spaces, with the series performing at its absolute peak sales-wise, with Volume 10 bringing in a massive 456,000 copies in its first month. MHA took the world by storm, absolutely exploding in popularity at this point. The fandom grew massive in what felt like one night, with massive shipping communities, general MHA sub-communities, and still sweeping every anime award show. It felt like you just couldn't get away from My Hero Academia. Hype was at an all-time high as people wondered what was in store for the series. Its pillar of justice was gone, and the definition of evil locked up, as our two sons wander the world with massive expectations on their shoulders. Act 2 would certainly be a turning point for both the anime and the manga in very different ways. Thank you everyone so much for watching this video. A lot of time and love went into this, and a lot of people worked on this. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe so this video can get out there to more people. You could also follow me and all the people who worked on this on Twitter. We're all objectively correct all the time, including Toini. And you could also join my Discord down below, where hopefully people will be talking about this video, and we also talk about the series as a whole. You could also get updates on the progression of the Act 2 video. Again, thank you so much for watching this. I know this is a long video, my longest ever, but I really hope you enjoyed it. Until next time.